Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto had different personality and acted like a demon. Some monsters are born, others are created, some redeem themselves, others have to be redeemed, but the worst monsters are those that were never monsters to begin with. A child's mind is a fragile thing, it will only take so much. The question is, what does it take to put back together? Find out here. Welcome aboard. Chapter 5, Fifth Link. Naruto, or Karasu, as he was increasingly identifying with, sat on a tree branch. His legs swung back and forth lazily. He swayed his chains beneath him like some glowing golden chandelier, endlessly delighting Kuma as the massive man stood beneath, batting the swaying chains like a kitten might a piece of string. Really, the man's childishness was unbelievable, especially considering his ungodly strength. While waiting for half their squad to report back to their desolate location, Naruto had little else to do. Thankfully his silent pleas were answered as Saro, Teiko and Nezumi all flickered into the surrounding trees. Naruto immediately, much to Kuma's distress, stopped what he was doing and snapped the chains back into his body like noodles being slurped up. The other three members of the squad stared at the two silently for a few moments before suddenly shaking their head and ignoring it. That was good, because Naruto didn't particularly want to explain himself. So, what's the damage? Before Naruto knew what hit him, something fast and powerful hit him right in the forehead. If he didn't have his mask on, he was sure that would have hurt. He looked over and just caught Saru's fingers coming out of a flicking motion which was probably connected to the small pebble now lying at the blonde's feet. Taicho. Saru nodded happily but wasn't the one to speak. Teiko took that honor. We scouted out the camps, seems the reports were accurate so far. The team was out here because Konoha had been getting increasing reports of oddly organized bandit raids on nearby towns. It almost reminded Naruto of his first mission out of the village. However, these were confirmed to have some kind of shinobi, or former shinobi influence behind them. The bandits weren't just organized, they were trained. Weaker than most genin they might have been, but with that many, quite possibly numbering in the hundreds, they were a threat. So did you find the leader? There had been sightings of at least one man using high-power jutsu during a few raids and less confirmed sightings of a group of less powerful people displaying shinobi-like abilities. They have, tense. Teiko nodded, quickly taking over from Nezumi again lest the briefing drag on into the night. A lot of them, it would be difficult for even me to search through them all without being spotted at least once, and we can't afford to tip them off to our presence just yet. Naruto growled as he dropped out of the tree, looking remarkably like a monkey as a chain emerged from his tailbone to swing him to the floor. Why don't we just wipe them all out, like before? A valid question. Their team comprised of a lot of firepower even if it wasn't in the form of widespread or flashy jutsu, things that tended to be frowned upon in the corp. Because Karasu. Saru punctuated his statement by slapping Naruto on the back of his head before the boy could react. We have a confirmed leader this time. If we tip him off and he escapes, then this will all simply repeat again in the future. Naruto just grinned, then they just didn't have to let anybody escape. Wouldn't that just mean repeat business for us? Taicho? Konoha was after all, a rather glorified mercenary group, as all ninja were. Saru just looked like he wanted to hit the boy again. Konoha isn't like that, he stressed. Plus, we would lose faith with the clients, he added as an afterthought. Whatever, so what do we do? Despite being at the level he could be rotated between A and BU cells, most of what he did was still a learning experience for Naruto. As much as he loathed to admit it, Saru was the teacher he had never really had. Hells, as far as Naruto was concerned, the man knew practically everything. After another clip around the ear for his lack of proper address, Saru explained, Kuma, Karasu and Nezumi will infiltrate the camp under Henge. You three are able to do the most amount of damage in the shortest amount of time and the closest thing we have to crowd control. Stay undetected for as long as possible. If any of you spot the leader of the camp you are to eliminate immediately without hesitation. Teiko and I will be waiting around the edges of the camp to pick off any stragglers that attempt to escape. That made sense. Taku and Saru were the fastest in the group along with Nezumi, and she was likely there to make sure Naruto and Kuma didn't do something stupid. Once the leader and any higher-level subordinates are dealt with. Saru paused for a moment and looked over to the faint glow on the horizon marking the massive bandit camp. Deal with everybody else as cleanly and as swiftly as possible. Naruto simply grinned, it all sounded good to him. When Naruto had heard they would be infiltrating under Henge, he hadn't quite expected this. For himself, he had simply given himself a nondescript appearance with mousy brown hair and added more than a few inches to his height. His clothing was plain and utilitarian, and the sword on his back looked more weather-beaten than it was. Kuma seemed to have gone for the same, taking a considerable amount of his bulk off and adding a few scars about his person. Nezumi, on the other hand, seemed to have a slight thing for the dramatic. The woman was knelt down in the mud at his feet, wearing nothing but a few strips of ragged cloth that did little to cover her modesty. Her hair, now a sandy blonde, hung about her watery and bloodshot eyes in messy bangs. She really looked the part of the beaten captive. It was lucky Naruto was too young to really be appreciating what he was seeing, as Nezumi hadn't seemed to edit any of her body structure, including her various curves. It was this attention to fine detail that got them easily waved past the entrance to the camp. Most eyes were on Nezumi's defeated form anyway, as she was roughly hauled forward by Kuma. They were quickly, and rather gleefully, directed towards a specific tent to deposit Nezumi. Naruto understood her choice in Henge when it turned out to be a tent almost solely filled with women in similar, or even worse states of dress and health. Naruto stared blankly at them all from behind his Henge's scowl before simply turning and leaving the tent, a strange feeling simmering in his stomach. Then, all of a sudden, he was in the camp. It was almost surprising how easy it was when these people were supposed to have a modicum of training and organization. It seemed they weren't expecting any attackers to simply waltz right in, all the better for Sara's team. Discreetly, Naruto pressed a finger against the invisible tattoo on his shoulder and pulsed his chakra through it twice. It was the signal they had set up for when they had successfully infiltrated. After he received the correct signal back, he nodded once to himself before setting off into the main section of the camp. For a while he simply milled about, as everybody else seemed to be doing. Occasionally he would pass through tents where bandits drank, ate, or fought amongst themselves. Other times he would come across another of those women-filled tents, that strange feeling pulling at his stomach again. For some reason his mind kept snapping back to how Nezumi had seemed, even if it was only a henge. The thought of the quiet woman he had come to know in a similar situation seemed inherently repugnant to Naruto, but the feeling was new and he couldn't explain it. He did his best to ignore it and focus on the mission, as he was sure his teammates were, of locating the leader. After around an hour of seemingly no progress, drifting from campfire to tent to training field, Naruto felt the beginnings of frustration creep up on him. It was seeming more and more tempting to simply flush out the leader by slaughtering a few of his subordinates. Even as those thoughts crossed his mind, he was forced to dodge to the side as the tent to his right practically exploded outward, a smoking figure being quickly blasted out through the fabric. They righted themselves in the air and landed with a crouch, a distinctly irritated expression on their scarred face. Immediately, the man's eyes locked onto Naruto's figure, and with a small start blonde realized his henge had dropped due to the small pieces of debris hitting him. Those coal-black eyes narrowed before the man straightened up and motioned for the nearest of the startled bandits around him. Konoha Shinobi. Get them! And with that he turned and bolted for it, no doubt using his followers as a meat shield to keep the shinobi off him. However, the only thing the men in the immediate vicinity could do was turn. Not a second later, each found a glowing gold chain occupying the space their heads once had. It seemed giving a bandit chakra didn't do much for their reflexes. Naruto found that moderately interesting as he was quickly joined by Kuma walking out of the smoking wreck of the tent. "The bad guy's getting away, Kuma," he called, already anticipating the reaction. Naruto could almost see the man's eye widen in childish shock behind his unsuitably ferocious mask. "No, wait. Bad man." Immediately Kuma shot off after him, and Naruto could only compare the sight to some rampaging demon. A bandit bravely tried to impose himself between the charging brute and his leader, only to having his head grabbed and summarily crushed in one fluid motion without the massive ANBU slowing down for a second. Another quickly found a knee buried rather deep in his chest cavity, only to be flicked to the side with the same ease one might swat an insect. There was a reason Naruto actually feared sparring against Kuma. Apart from the man's apparent inability to hold back in any capacity, he was damn near impossible to harm. For a while people thought it might be some kind of Kekkai Genkai that just toughened the man. After all, Naruto had once seen kunai literally bounce off him. It couldn't really be confirmed, as Kuma knew nothing of his origins, having been found in an underground fighting tournament in the land of hot water by an ANBU raid. Even then, the young dark-skinned boy had been a threat to the people around him, as mentally unbalanced as he was. ANBU had taken that raw potential and turned it into a vicious weapon that could smash right through enemy ranks. However, in all that time Kuma had somehow managed to retain a form of childlike innocence to it all. Naruto once found himself envying the man, at least until he had spotted him chasing a butterfly for a good half hour. There was innocence, and then there was stupidity, and Kuma swerved all over that line. It would have been amusing to watch the brutish Anbu chase down the leader of the bandits if said thugs hadn't immediately swarmed toward Naruto. Unfortunately for them, they had identified him as the less threatening target. They were right, of course, but that was like saying the Ichibi was a less threatening target than the Kyuubi. True, but it didn't help them in the slightest. Naruto summarily pointed out their mistake with the very pointy ends of his chains, a smile slowly slipping over his features as blood began to run through his blonde locks to stain them red. In Anbu, Naruto was joked to have red hair more often than it was blonde. In the middle of that bandit camp, among men slightly more powerful than the common thug, he showed why. His chains moved like the arms of an octopus, stabbing and slicing without Naruto even having to move at all. His arms suddenly whipped around, sword held comfortably in hand, as the clang of metal rang out. Around him a dozen kunai dropped to the floor uselessly, easily diverted. Naruto found his swordsmanship to be a lot easier and more natural when he was standing still. It meant he didn't mess the footwork up. Pfft, Anbu, we should have known your type would come sooner or later. In front of him was a tall, well-endowed young woman with cold gray eyes that burned imperiously at him. You know, I've always hated those stupid masks of yours, always looking so emotionless and superior. She snorted derisively again as she dodged out the way of a chain erupting from the ground. Look at you, just a stupid kid. That comment was met by quite a few more chains that forced the woman into a few rather flexible positions to escape unscathed. Is that all you got? The woman's eyes snapped to the man now standing uncertainly behind the blonde ever since she had arrived. What are you waiting around for? The men quickly scrambled into action at her thunderous voice. Alright, Arashi-sama. Anything they might have done was rendered moot as Naruto suddenly melted into the floor like it was liquid. That set everyone on edge, including the newcomer. A moment later and her eyes widened, she moved to warn a few of the men, but it was too late. Evanescent chains bust from their bodies out of the ground like clinking metal vipers only to yank them off their feet and back towards Naruto. He stood behind them and used the three bodies as an impromptu shield against a hail of kunai and shuriken. Damn it, what the hell are you, kid? Arashir had never seen an ability like this in all her time, even after abandoning Tagakure with her teammates before it could be disarmed. Her answer came from the most surprising of places, namely, through her chest. Her eyes widened in surprise, not having expected the chains to be able to extend so far, before coughing up blood and falling limply to the side. The remaining bandits in the area seemed to see her death and freeze before looking at the little blood-covered demon responsible. Run! Naruto smiled beneath his chipped mask as he watched them flee from him, the limp body of one of their commanders still suspended in the air. He walked after them at a steady pace, knowing that stragglers would get picked off by the others. He simply moved further into the camp where he knew there would be more. Orders were orders after all. Naruto stood with the rest of his squad looking down at the two dead bodies of the bandits' leaders and the unconscious body of the last member of their group. Teiko had caught him trying to subtly make his departure once the fighting began and had swiftly knocked him out. Behind them a large mass of dirty, crying and barely clothed women huddled around awkwardly. Apparently Nezumi had prioritized getting them out of the camp before they could be used as hostages. It meant little for Naruto, who was now quite thoroughly drenched in blood. It just meant more for him. Right, mission accomplished, now we just need to figure out what to do with the women. They weren't part of the briefing. At that point Naruto drifted out of the conversation, as he tended to do when it turned to matters that didn't interest him. Anyway, every time Saru mentioned the women he thought back to their treatment and that irritating pull in his stomach started again, so he did his best to tune it out. That was why he was the first to notice the last of the shinobi on the ground stirring. He quickly helped the waking process along with a chain through the man's leg, awaking him with a start and a scream of pain. That wasn't really necessary, Karasu. Naruto shrugged at his captain with a smile he was thankful couldn't be seen. However, as he looked down at the golden chain emerging from the man's leg he winced slightly, a hand going to his temple. I am sorry. Naruto backed up shakily from the young boy on the floor, looking in horror at the bright chain that was stabbed all the way through his lower leg. I didn't mean to, you jumped and I thought, I'm so sorry. His words came out as a fast jumble as he held his arms out in front of him, desperately willing his chain to retract. He wasn't very used to them at the moment and it was like they had a mind of their own. The boy on the other hand just glared up at her with a wince from the pain. Shut up and go get sensei, you tomato-headed idiot. This is why I didn't want to be on the team with the stupid foreigner. Each word was like a stabbing knife to Naruto's chest and he felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He brushed his long hair away from his eyes along with the tears and turned to go find their sensei. However, to his horror, he realized he was just wiping the boy's blood on his cheek. He wanted to retch from the smell but kept it in as he ran off, tears still streaming from his eyes. Naruto swayed slightly as the memory rushed through him and apparently that was enough distraction for the team that the now awake man saw his opportunity. He grabbed something out his pouch and brought it to his mouth. Nazumi's sword was off her back and nothing but a silver streak, but it was too late. Her slash had simply slit open the capsule and the man quickly swallowed the powder that fell out. Even as his mouth started to foam and blood leaked from his tear ducts, he managed a victorious smirk at the assembled ANBU before slumping to the side, dead. Well, damn. Teiko's succinct words quickly summed up the feelings of the small squad. To the side though, Naruto's hand clenched into a fist so tight his fingernails began to draw blood. These damn flashbacks had just cost them an important captive and there was still nothing he could do about them. Naruto rubbed the side of his face with a small sigh. He had an itch on his nose that he really wanted to scratch, but his mask stopped him. It was testament to the success of his ANBU training that he didn't just rip the porcelain crow mask right off. No, he rarely saw the world through something other than the holes of his mask these days, although it wasn't as though they restricted his vision in any way. In fact, half the time Naruto wouldn't even realize he was wearing something. It had become a part of him, like his uniform or his sword. The only times he would take it off these days was to sleep, and half the time he was too tired to even bother. Right now, he sat reclining in front of a medium-sized polished black stone in Training Ground 3, his eyes scanning slowly across the names scrawled in small, tight script on its surface. There were hundreds, if not thousands of names on that stone, each a citizen of Konoha that had given their life at some point for the protection of the village. This would be where he would end up one day if he fell while in the Corp ANBU that died in the field left no evidence in the form of a body. He had only recently been told about this place, or rather overheard some other operatives talking about it. To be honest, though, he wasn't quite sure why he was here, slowly letting his eyes drift across the names. He was quite surprised to have already found quite a few people bearing the name Uzumaki, even though currently in the village he was the only one. He wondered if they were his relatives. However, the Hokage had never told him anything about having a family. He just quietly assumed as an unnamed orphan he was given a random name, and that was the end of it. Ryo, for your thoughts? Naruto snapped to his feet so quickly it almost looked like his body flickered on the spot, his chain snapping out at speeds that caused an audible crack. Luckily, whoever snuck up on him so silently was also quite fast. They twisted their body out of the way of what could only be described as a waterfall of chakra constructs. The young blonde stopped short when he realized just who it was, an irritated growl coming from his throat as he retracted the chains. Teiko-senpai. The short man chuckled humorously as he glanced about at the pockmarks and small craters Naruto's attack had caused in the ground. Damn, feeling a bit touchy today, kid? Naruto just grunted before swiveling back down into a seating position so he could look at the memorial again. Thankfully he hadn't damaged it. That would have been irritating to explain. What do you want, senpai? Teiko, like Saro, had the annoying tendency of correcting Naruto when he forgot the proper suffixes for his superiors. However, in the shorter man's case those corrections would often involve introducing Naruto to some rather confusing magazines. The young blonde found he would rather have a cuff about the head and just referred to Teiko properly. Nothing, kid, nothing, I'm here for the same reason you are. For the memorial. Naruto blinked. Of all his teammates and makeshift sensei, Teiko was one of the more mysterious. He never really talked about himself without prompting, and Naruto wasn't the type to ask, so he knew little about the man. He knew at least about Kuma's origins, the reason for Nazumi's infatuation with weaponry which was due to her father, and Saro was an open book if you asked him anything. Naruto could have simply ignored the passing comment as he normally would have, choosing to remain in a more comfortable silence, but for some reason today was different. Family? He nearly choked on the word trying to get it out, fighting with his own stubbornness and naturally antisocial behavior. There was also the small fact family was a rather touchy subject for the volatile young ANBU member, being an orphan. Teiko just chuckled quietly though as he took a cross-legged seat beside the boy. On here? No. The boy simply quirked his head in the older man's direction out of confusion. Picking up on it he chuckled again. I had family, yes, but not in Konoha. Coming out here reminds me of them somewhat. I suppose it's just the atmosphere. Naruto nodded slowly, although he couldn't say he understood. Still, there was something about his answer that niggled at the back of his mind. Where exactly are you from? Even through the slight garbling of the ANBU's mask, Takeo had an odd accent Naruto had never heard before, and in his brief stint in the corp he had been to quite a few countries. Oh, you wouldn't know it, I'm from the lands out west, from the elemental nations. Naruto's eyes widened fractionally. He didn't know much about that area because it wasn't even charted on most maps. Seeming to catch his surprise, Takeo patted him on the back quickly. I wouldn't put too much thought into it, kid. It's not a great place, all arid land spotted with a few towns. They have chakra, but they don't use it quite like shinobi out here do. Naruto actually found himself wanting to ask more, but Takeo seemed to beat him to it. Out there they have something like samurai that act as a police force for the rest of the nation. All of them are under the control of one man. He calls himself the Huangdi. Naruto raised an eyebrow, wondering why the two nations didn't have as much interactions as they did. Again, Takeo preempted his questions. There's a massive swath of land that's completely inhospitable between the two continents. Trying to bring an army across it is tantamount to suicide. The occasional traveler or small group can get through, but it lacks the resources to even be worth fighting for. He leaned back more and looked up at the sky as silence descended on them. For the first time in a long time though, Naruto found the quiet to be uncomfortable. You said you had family? Takeo cocked his head, as if surprised Naruto was actually asking. Even the blonde was surprised at himself, even if his question came out slightly gruff. A wife and 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. His answer was rather curt, and once again an awkward silence bathed the small clearing. This time Naruto didn't try any further, sensing a sore spot with the little tact he had gained over the past 2 years. Instead, he turned back to the memorial, eyes naturally skipping between names looking for those that began with U. For about 5 minutes neither said anything, and Naruto had begun to skim through the names from around the Kyuubi attack, for which there were a lot. However, suddenly his body froze. Uzumaki. Kushina. Takeo looked around at Naruto lazily, not having quite heard what he said, only to see the boy fall to the ground, hands clasped to the sides of his head. More worryingly though were the twin streams of blood trickling out the boy's ears and, although he couldn't see it, his nose. That's my little Kushi-chan, eat up. A kindly woman's voice spoke softly to him, although her face seemed blurry and undefined. Her long red hair was vivid and very real. He reached out with small pudgy hands to grasp at strands of it, burbling happily. However, he found his little clasping hands repelled as instead a spoon was pushed in front of him. Kushina. Naruto's hands flailed madly as he was dragged away from the collapsing building. He didn't understand what was going on, but it was loud and the ground was shaking. About him the people he had grown up knowing raced around him, those glinting steel objects they always carried around cutting through the air. He turned back, arms reached out to the man under a small pile of rubble, his purple eyes looked back to him, expression indecipherable. Then something hit the back of his head and all he saw was darkness. Ha, look at her, with that stupid red hair and round face, she looks like some kind of tomato. Naruto's eyes widened in shock as he looked out over the small sea of young faces staring back at her. Suddenly they all erupted into laughter at the one boy's comment. Tears prickled in his eyes, but he fought them back, hands slowly tightening at his side. Kushina, stop this. He saw nothing but red, his hair falling messily about him as he drove another fist into the boy's stomach, a vindictive smile across his features. He was soon thrown off the boy by their instructor, who spared no time in quickly checking over the boy's bruised and battered form. To the side Naruto just panted, feeling a dull ache begin in his knuckles. Did you hear about what she did to Kasuke? Tomato? More like some kind of habanero. Naruto smirked as he walked past the group of whispering students. I knew she was trouble, you can't trust foreigners like her. Naruto nearly faltered in his step but managed to keep going, a short stabbing pain going through his chest as his pace quickened. It's okay, Kushina-chan, it'll be okay. Naruto couldn't stop the flood of tears as he sobbed into Mito's chest. Why did he have to come to this place? Why did he have to be the one to shoulder this burden alone? Why him? He missed his home, he missed his family. Kushina, that was amazing. Naruto felt a rush of energy run through him as he rushed into Minato's arms, letting the boy pick him up and swing him around. His brand new Chunin jacket hung off his arm and a bright gleaming smile was permanently plastered to his face. Kushi-chan, over here. Naruto's smile brightened as he spotted Makoto waving from across the training ground. She looked particularly excited about something and was rushing across to meet him. Why was her ring finger glinting like that? Listen to your motor mouth, mother, Naruto. A light chuckle managed to burst from Naruto's throat as Minato spoke from behind him, only to send another racking wave of pain through his form. However, he never let go of the claw pushing through his stomach, never lost his grip with his feet. Nothing was going to harm his son. Nothing at Tebane. Ag. Naruto jolted upright, panting heavily and his entire body drenched with cold sweat. After a few moments of internal panic, he realized he was in his bed, in his apartment. After a few moments clambering about, he found his mask on the bedside table and slipped it on, instantly calming down with the comforting and familiar presence back on his face. He had to move it to the side though when he felt wetness on his cheeks and a stinging in his eyes. He rubbed them only to look in surprise at the tears on his fingers. There was a burning pain in his heart and a throbbing in his temples, and Naruto just felt overall exhausted. This had to stop, he just couldn't take it anymore. Are you sure about this, Kohai? It seems a fairly extreme measure, and if this condition weren't affecting your mission capability, I wouldn't even be suggesting it, Saro intoned in a mildly concerned voice. Naruto met his gaze unflinchingly, reaching out for the small cloth strip in his captain's hand. They were standing in their squad's usual training ground, isolated away from the village by the surrounding forest. Like I said, I need a solution and there are no other options at this point. He took the small strip, which was clearly some form of thin collar, and looked at it for a moment. He had gone to Saro asking for a solution to the memories of who he now knew to be Uzumaki Kushina, his mother. The man had figured out that the flashbacks seemed to be closely tied to his emotions, so his best bet was to work on controlling them. Kuma thinks this is a bad idea. Naruto ignored the large man's unusually timid voice as he took a deep breath and quickly snapped the collar into place around his neck. It felt cool against his skin. There, problem solved. Now how is this supposed to help? Saro sighed at the boy's rashness before switching over into what his squad affectionately named lecture mode. One's emotions are closely linked to their physiological state. The seals on the collar detect these internal changes and correct you if you have one of your outbursts. Naruto's eyes narrowed in irritation. What do you mean my outbuga? Naruto's hands flew up to his neck as the collar suddenly gave him a short shock that was incredibly painful. Ah! What the hegag? Again, the collar sent a wave of electricity through his body that was powerful enough to cause pain, but not enough to induce spasms. Like I said, it reacts to physiological changes. The angrier you get, the more it shocks you. Sara's words seemed lost though as Naruto fell to the ground, wrestling with the collar at his neck and crying out in pain each time it shocked him. Saro just quietly put a hand to his temple as he turned to Nezumi, who was watching the proceedings with an impassive stare. This may take some time. Taicho. Saro found he could only nod at her summation. However, he suddenly remembered something important and turned back to the struggling boy. Oh, and if you try to remove the collar, A very uncharacteristic and remarkably high-pitched scream ripped from Naruto's throat as he tried to rip the small, seal-inscribed choker from his neck. It shocks you? Oh good, you figured it out. Naruto just glared darkly up at him from the floor, at least before he jerked back from another shock. Yes, this may take some time after all. Chapter 6, Sixth Link. Naruto regulated his breathing carefully as he forced his body not to twitch even a single muscle. Right now, he was in the darkened corner of an unassuming ceiling, thankful that the meager candlelight in the room cast long and heavy shadows to hide in. Two men sat at a table, quietly discussing various unimportant topics over a simplistic kotatsu. The young blonde, now entering into his teen years at the ripe age of 13, had been trailing one of the men for almost a week now, and he had to say it was quite possible one of the most boring assignments he had ever received. Normally, considering his short fuse, it would have been a miracle he hadn't already attacked the man and decided to get the information that way, but it was undeniable Naruto had matured in his time spent in ANBU. Saro's idea, what had colloquially been called tomato therapy due to Naruto's unwholesome reaction to people using the word around him, had been a tentative success. The blonde's emotional control had improved, and after a while, around 5 months, the flashbacks to Kushina's memories had stopped altogether. Naruto continued to wear the deactivated collar, as a reminder never to slip back into old habits. His control wasn't the only thing to change though. He had grown up a great deal, reaching a height that could be called above average for his age group at 151 centimeters. His training had given him a nice and developed muscle tone that showed clearly defined muscles without making him bulky like Kuma. His hair had also grown out, his spikes becoming longer and wavier, although over the years he was unsettled to find the occasional red hair in amongst his blonde locks. Any changes to his face though could rarely be seen, as the boy was seldom seen without his mask, save when it got damaged on missions, which was almost comically common. All in all, one might say he had really grown into his role as an ANBU operative, and had garnered respect from a number of its members for the efficient way he handled missions. However, there was no changing the fact that he was on that squad and was bound to cause chaos wherever he went. It had simply become a part of life. Almost as much as seeing Kuma challenging other ANBU's summons to board games, Teiko being thrown out of the women's hot springs, or seeing Nezumi walk around the apartment complex almost completely naked. He never said it was a normal life. He stirred slightly as the two men exchanged farewells and quickly went their separate ways. Having no intention of losing his target, the blonde quickly made his own exit, using a chain from his back to lift up a ceiling panel and slip in. Normally his chakra chains would have been terrible for stealthy missions like this due to their inherent glow. However, over time Naruto had worked on it and managed to make them duller, becoming a pale gray color. When he did this though, they became woefully brittle and would likely break against bare skin. All the same, they sometimes came in handy, and soon Naruto was out on the roof, sticking to the shadows the crescent moon cast. He continued to stalk his target silently, an older man with a receding hairline in a rough and worn kimono that never seemed to stray much out of his routine of his home, his bar, and his business meetings. Tonight seemed to be an exception, as he abruptly ducked down an alley, quickly followed by his unseen tail. There was another man waiting for him by an unlit door, and both were swiftly ushered in. Interest piqued, Naruto slipped in before the door could close, nothing but a vague breeze to the people inside. I'm still unsure of this location, Aki, so close to Konoha? Why take the risk? It was Naruto's target that spoke, in a low voice that matched well with his hefty weight. They will never suspected Matsui. Anyway, Konoha only keeps a fledgling guard of the towns between them and Kawa. The new man explained as Naruto slipped into a more comfortable and secure position in the ceiling's corner. Any greater presence and Suna might begin to take offense. Okay, fine, how are they? We need them in good condition after all for this to be an efficient process. Naruto's ears twitched. The reason he was even on this mission was to investigate the disappearances of a large number of farmers and villagers in towns around Hai no Kuni's border. They're just fine, fed and kept healthy just like we were asked. The new man led Naruto's target Matsui to a door set into the floor, and the two quickly descended a set of stone steps into a basement. Naruto followed, but slightly more unconventionally, as he slipped through hand seals and dived into the ground using Earth-style, subterranean voyage. When his head poked out into the basement his eyes widened marginally. It was a much greater room than he had been expecting, and it was nearly packed to the brim with people in cages of various sizes. Is it almost finished? Matsui asked, as he looked over towards a ceiling matrix inscribed on a large scroll in the middle of the cages. They all seemed to be arranged around the scroll so they were an equal distance from it. The people inside looked pale and emaciated, none of them appearing to have the energy to move or cry out. All they did was shuffle on the floor or occasionally moan. Naruto quickly realized why when he felt a slight tug on his chakra. Whatever the seal was, it was draining the chakra from these people. It should be done now. The seal was pulsing excitedly even as Aki spoke, and the man quickly walked over and rolled the scroll back up, carefully balancing the enormous roll of paper on his shoulder. Good, I hate being down here, Matsui muttered, rubbing his stomach slowly where he had no doubt felt the pull of the seal. Well, it won't be too many more now, don't worry. Naruto's face remained impassive as he sunk back into the earthen wall to report to his teammates. Something a lot bigger was going on than just kidnappings. Naruto hovered at the back of the mission briefing room, idly swaying on his feet as he tuned out most of the conversation around him. Sara would tell him what he had to do later anyway. There was more ANBU in this one room than he had ever seen before, all of them watching as the ANBU commander allocated their roles in the upcoming operation. It had turned out something much larger than just run-of-the-mill slave kidnappings was occurring in Hai no Kuni. Apparently, a lot of operatives had corroborated Naruto's information, and similar such chakra seals were being used throughout the border towns. Currently they didn't know their purpose, but another squad had learned of a large gathering place for more than a few of their targets. They were going to go in, take out everybody there and stop what they were doing. If possible, they would also find out who was orchestrating the events. That was the gist of the meeting anyway, and beyond that Naruto didn't need to know much else. Go in, kill people, that was his job and he enjoyed it. Especially when the people he had to kill really pushed his limits. There was nothing Naruto Uzumaki loved than a challenging fight, the adrenaline, the rush as he felt his opponent's fear, the pain keeping it all crystal clear. It was intoxicating. Suddenly people were moving. Naruto naturally migrated over to his squad, only to be diverted by Saro towards a small group of ANBU Naruto didn't know all that well. During his 5 years in the corp, Naruto had worked with many operatives, from veterans of decades or more, to rookies on their first missions. From what he knew, he could find no real link between this group, and they weren't a normal squad that he knew of. What's going on? Saru just kept a firm grip on his shoulder as he guided the blonde out with the other masked men and began quickly moving through the village. You weren't listening again, were you? It wasn't a question and there was no safe answer, so Naruto remained quiet. He still got cuffed around the back of the head all the same. It irked the blonde that his captain could still do that despite all the advances he had made in ANBU, his captain was just too damn fast. You and I are on the sealing team, we're to stay on standby while the others perform the sweep. Naruto blinked, however, he was unsurprised to learn his captain knew Fuinjutsu. The man's calligraphy was impeccable and Naruto was still convinced he secretly knew everything. Why? Sara didn't look around as they took the ANBU tunnels out of the village, skirting around the barrier surrounding the village. Because somebody is gathering a huge amount of chakra in one place and they are using Fuinjutsu to do so. Sara intoned in a blank, intentionally emotionless voice. Konoha needs to be prepared in kind. Naruto growled lowly, a vast improvement on what he might have done a few years ago. He knew his captain knew exactly what he meant and was purposefully skirting the question. No, why am I on the team? I don't know anything about Fuinjutsu. By now the small, unorthodox squad that Naruto now knew to be Fuinjutsu users, had taken to the trees and their pace had picked up considerably. You may not, but... Sara poked the blonde on the forehead, or at least on the mask's forehead, somebody in you does. Naruto looked down, his hand clenching for a moment, before he released a calming breath. He didn't like being reminded of his mother's memories, always niggling at the back of his mind. He was his own person, he was his own person, he was his own person. The mantra continued until he felt himself calm. Maybe, but evidently those memories haven't come to me yet. Despite that, he couldn't mask his curiosity when Sara produced a small scroll, opening it up to reveal a complex array on the paper. What is this? He asked, still with that emotionless yet oddly conversational tone. A barrier seal, Naruto answered without even thinking. He blinked a moment later before scowling. That doesn't mean I'll be much help in this squad, just recognizing Fuinjutsu won't do a lot. I should be with the others, on the front lines, where I'm most effective. Sara shrugged as he returned the scroll to one of his pouches. His squad mates often joked they were bigger in the inside. Considering the revelation that he knew Fuinjutsu, not an impossibility. Maybe not, your chains have far more uses than you might imagine. Naruto's scowl didn't change and he quickly turned away from the man, continuing to dash through the trees in silence for a few minutes. How do you know so much? He couldn't see due to the mask, but he was sure Saro smirked at him as the man tapped the side of his head knowingly. A moment later though, and the man sighed, a sound rarely heard from the sagely captain. I knew your mother, Kushina. That little tidbit nearly made Naruto stumble and fall off the next branch he landed on, only to catch himself with a chain and swing on. What? Since when? Naruto felt his temper rising slightly only to wince as he felt the phantom shock around his neck and instantly calmed himself, looking at his superior questioningly. I was in the class above hers in the academy and later I went on many missions with her as a chunin before joining ANBU. He admitted softly, when you joined the squad, I had my suspicions about your heritage due to the chains, but I thought they might be a general trait of your family, so I couldn't be sure. He watched cautiously as Naruto went silent for a few moments. The boy had excellent emotional control normally, but he could still be temperamental and unpredictable on bad days. Why did you never say anything? Sara nodded at seeing Naruto wouldn't fly off the handle at him, although the testy tone made him choose his words carefully. I thought it would impact negatively on our relationship as captain and subordinate for you to know. It was hard, but Naruto could accept that at least. As long as he had known the man, Sara had never had anything but the squad's interests at heart. What changed? Sara looked at him and once again Naruto could feel the smirk behind the monkey-themed mask. You did. You are more mature now, better able to accept the information and think about it rationally. I couldn't say the same for your younger self, especially under the emotional stress you were already facing at the time from experiencing your mother's memories. Again, Naruto was forced to accept this. He recognized that the whim of today was very different to the one of 3 years ago. What does this have to do with the mission? Naruto asked, eager to move the conversation on. He felt like prolonged reminders of his mother would only induce more of her memories, a state he wasn't happy to return to. Your mother's chains had the rather unique property of being excellent at controlling bijou. I believe it was due to their density. On the night of the Kyuubi attack she was purported to have held down the beast for almost half a minute as the yandame performed the sealing. Naruto winced, feeling a phantom pain in his stomach as Saru mentioned that night. Kushina's memories of being impaled by a massive white claw were fresh in his mind. And you think my chains are the same? What good would that do? A small chuckle escaped his captain as the man leaped off another branch. If you had listened during the briefing you would know, Saru shot back, with more than a hint of amusement in his voice. Naruto just growled to show his displeasure. They should make the briefings more interesting if they wanted him to listen. The ANBU commander believes that the people we are hunting may be trying to create their own bijou. Naruto's eyes widened, his hand moving to the seal inscribed on his stomach for a moment, a gesture not missed by Saru. Oh no, nothing on the scale of the Kyuubi likely. Human chakra is not dense enough to form such a creature. Saru shook his head and returned his attention to the path through the trees in front of them. No, it would be a smaller, but by all rights no less dangerous creature. It wouldn't be the first time somebody has attempted it after seeing the raw power the beasts control. They are never successful, and the process is almost always devastating. That is why we have to strike early before they can finish. For the first time, Naruto heard the slight twinge of nervousness in his normally carefree and sagely voice. So, they need me and my chains. He didn't finish, looking down as a small golden snake of lynx emerged from his wrist, the pointed end turning to him as if it was able to see. As a precaution in case they are successful, yes. Saru looked around at him and inclined his head in what passed for a smile in the ANBU. You shouldn't be too worried about it though. Konoha has become quite efficient at stamping out such large-scale threats as these. Naruto nodded back at him after a moment's hesitation. However, at the thought of fighting a bijou the blonde couldn't help but feel his blood begin to boil. His hands clenched in anticipation and a small part of him actually wanted them to succeed. He didn't voice his thoughts for obvious reasons. As Naruto stared up at the hulking mass of energy and chakra bearing down on their small group, he decided then and there that perhaps his Taicho didn't know everything. The operation had been going so well too, then something had gone wrong during the sweep of the compound. They weren't sure what happened, but the end result was this. It's big. Naruto's deadpan didn't do it justice. The light blue, slightly ethereal mass of chakra towered above them, at least 5 stories tall. It seemed to lack any defined form or shape, and if one squinted, they could make out the stars through its glowing, translucent body. However, it had arms, big ones, that ended in very large and apparently very sharp claws that cut great gouges through the earth as it moved. The beast seemed in conflict with itself over what state it wanted to be in, as half the time the various jutsu ANBU were throwing at it just bounced off, the other times they passed right through the creature. It seemed confused as it thrashed about, raising up its massive, thick arms to ward off the jutsu that didn't pass through it. It also seemed very angry, its large white eyes that were its only hint of a face narrowed as it let out an inhuman roar. The noise sent shivers through every operative's spine. Naruto looked towards his captain but the man motioned for him to wait. It was torture, the blonde was itching to move and do something. He couldn't just ignore the rampaging proto-bijou in front of him and his blood was calling for him to get involved. Thankfully, after a few minutes of the other ANBU ineffectually doing anything to stop it, Saru finally gave him the signal. The other ANBU currently battling the creature with thinly veiled fear watched in confusion and shock as a small blonde meteorite suddenly passed overhead, screaming out his excitement as long golden whips speared out of his body. The proto-bijou didn't seem to know what to make of the new arrival and moved one of its great lumbering arms to swat it away. It was rightfully surprised then when the swaying golden tentacles suddenly separated before spinning madly, winding their way up the thick, bulbous arm like a family of constricting snakes. Far from the jutsu that had been thrown at it, the beast could feel every one of the chains holding its arm. A moment later, when Naruto landed on the ground in front of it, its surprise was once again evident as the boy squared his feet and pulled on his chains with a grunt of exertion. The beast vainly tried to pull against the blonde, but with chains emerging from his back and rooting him to the ground he proved the stronger of the two. With a mighty crash that set the ground around them rumbling, the proto-bijou fell to the floor with an ear-screeching cry of anguish. Naruto on the other hand grinned as he rocketed forward, hoping to take advantage of the fall and pin more of the beast down. He barely acknowledged the oppressive atmosphere affecting the other operatives and cried out in glee, swinging himself up and over the beast. A moment later he found his flight path radically altered. An enormous semi-transparent hand slammed into his body with the kind of force that should have shattered his spine. Just beginning to pick itself up, the beast quickly identified Naruto as a threat and naturally tried to get the blonde as far away from it as possible. Sara watched the small blonde blur with worry as he was sent careening back into the forest. He was forced to shelf his concern in favor of the mission, turning to direct the small sealing team into their positions for when the other operative managed to finally suppress the creature. Fuinjutsu was a delicate process and they would need all the time they could to get to have everything prepared. He allowed himself a quick glance at the path of destruction the blonde's body had made, as a group of ANBU attempted to trap the beast in a large clay oven and roast it. It didn't do much. Naruto lay in a small trench in the ground carved by his body. His eyes were wide and dazed and his mask was completely shattered. A few cuts littered his body and he was fairly certain his left arm was broken. All the same, an all too happy grin split his features as he staggered to his feet, ignoring how the world seemed to lurch around him for a moment. His breathing was heavy but he wasn't exhausted, and there was an odd tingling sensation throughout his entire body, but he felt little pain. Slowly, as red began to descend over his vision and he felt the bones in his arm snap back into place, the grin on his features took on a more malicious aspect. He didn't even realize when he started running. The world blurred around him as his periphery failed to keep up with his body. When the beast came into view from the tree line, a half-formed tail beginning to emerge from the base of what passed for its spine, he already knew what to do. Everybody else simply saw a vague red blur fly past, but what was more important was how they felt. Everybody recognized the sensation of the Kyuubi's chakra from that fateful day 13 years ago. It was more oppressive even than the beasts they were fighting. Hi-ya! The joyous, if not slightly sadistic sounding, cry coming from the boy dissuaded some of their fears that he had lost control, but did little to ease the sudden unpleasant feeling in all their stomachs. When hundreds of bright, glimmering chains that looked as though they had been dyed in fresh blood suddenly erupted from the boy, they felt some of their worries ease. Flying through the air like that, with chains flaying out all about him without rhyme or reason, he almost looked like some kind of large sea urchin. The proto-bijou noticed his arrival too and quickly made to swat the nuisance away again. The attempt was only met with pain. Numerous chains stabbed indiscriminately into its body, eliciting glass-shattering screams of fury that caused more than a few operatives to shield their ears and look away. Naruto took the distraction in stride and grinned wolfishly as he landed on the creature's chest, the chains around him thrashing and slashing like they were possessed. Every gash bled a weak bluish mist. The beast began writhing madly in an attempt to shake off its tormentor. Nothing it did seemed to dislodge the boy. In fact, as Naruto slowly worked his way up the creature's body, more and more chains whipped out, tying up its arms, its neck, its body, until finally, with a stifled groan, the beast slowly toppled over to one side, completely immobilized. There was a shocked and odd silence for a long few moments as the ANBU simply looked at the red-tinged boy standing atop the proto-bijou, panting and grinning madly. The tension was broken the moment Saru began barking out orders, both to the regular operatives to attempt to secure the limbs properly, and to the sealing team to get ready. He was worried about Naruto, especially about the deformed, spiked chains he was now producing, but that worry would have to wait until the creature was dealt with. Even so, he spared glances up at the boy, unnerved by the red-slitted eyes Naruto seemed to have gained at some point, and the increasing feeling of despair emanating from that noxious red chakra. The beast seemed to glow brighter for a moment as the sealing team began running through their long chain of hand seals, its body becoming less solid. Greater wisps of a gaseous blue substance Saru could only assume was chakra, began to leak from its many wounds into the air. However, just as he was beginning to think the sealing was working, the proto-bijou managed to lift its head and let out a soul-shattering scream before exploding outwards. There was no great force or even a particularly loud sound, the beast simply swelled for a moment before bursting into that same blue mist. It quickly dissipated into the night air, leaving the clearing oddly quiet. If Sara wasn't busy coordinating the operatives around him, he might have noted how the little specks of blue light dancing about before winking out of existence was rather beautiful. His concern right now though was more pressing, namely, Naruto. The boy was standing in place, looking around confusedly as his mutated and spiky chains swayed ominously, looking entirely like snakes waiting to come across a fresh meal. Worryingly, his eyes were still colored red and the malicious, unnatural grin on his lips hadn't left his features. Luckily for him, lucky in that he wasn't forced to intervene and take action against his young subordinate before he became a threat, Nezumi flickered next to Naruto's side. Sara genuinely though the blonde was going to attack her then, but apparently a few words sufficed to calm him enough that the oppressive feeling in the air lifted. His decidedly less evil-looking chains soon followed, retreating into his body almost churlishly. Nezumi handed him a replacement mask, and that was that, a potentially catastrophic crisis averted. Saro would have to ask Nezumi what she said later. However, right now the cogs in the older captain's head were turning fiercely. He always knew this time would come, but he had hoped it would be in a few more years. With a sigh he placed his concerns to the side and turned his full attention back to the cleanup. Naruto could be dealt with back in Konoha. Naruto clutched his head with a groan as he picked himself up unsteadily, the last few minutes a mashed-up blur in his mind. Shakily, he looked about the clearing, noting the large craters and gouge marks in the training ground that hadn't been there last time he was lucid. He looked down, only to jump back in shock as instead of his normal hand he saw his fingers bent into claws, his nails lengthening and sharpened. When he looked again it was gone, and his hand was normal, although he probably stared at it for a little too long. Another failure it seems, Saro said from somewhere to his left. A moment later the man, looking a little worse for wear with scratches in his uniform, appeared in the clearing, quickly followed by the rest of the squad. All of them looked a little beaten up, but none of them seemed angered or upset by it, perhaps just a little weary. Nezumi seemed worst off for it, her uniform shredded and her sword having gained a few new nicks to add to the collection. Naruto supposed it was because she would be the one fending off his chains when he was in that state. For the past week or so he had been working with his squad to start to control the Kyuubi's power within him. It was part of his life as a Jinchuriki and Naruto had accepted that. However, it turned out to be a little more difficult than they anticipated. Accessing the chakra itself wasn't all that problematic. Naruto compared it to how he would use his chains, simply digging within himself until he felt the right signature. However, the Kyuubi's chakra was denser, angrier. It didn't respond as well to his directions and had a will of its own the blonde had to constantly work to control. The more chakra he accessed, the more the Kyuubi's will bleed through and the harder it was to control. It got to the point where their two wills began clashing, and his body, with the chakra running rampant inside of him, went out of control and attacked pretty much anything in the vicinity with a heartbeat. It seems that was what had just happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last time. He was lucky to have his squad acting as a safety net until he could withdraw the potent chakra back inside of him. Nevertheless, he still felt enraged by his own lack of control. Naruto breathed heavily, his eyes wide and bright as his mouth twisted into an animalistic grin that wasn't completely his own. He felt amazing, more powerful than he had ever felt as his body screamed with energy from his head to his toes. His chains swayed about him, spiked and ugly, however, Naruto saw them as perfect, just right for ripping and tearing through his enemies. They felt natural, correct even, and it was almost as if they were agreeing with him. Just as they whispered to him that his job wasn't quite complete, and there were still people breathing around him, a familiar face flickered into view. Nezumi. His voice was gruffer than he remembered, like a much deeper voice was trying to overlap with his own. He grinned up at the woman. If anybody would understand his new power it would be his teammates. Perhaps like this he would even be strong enough to take on Saro. I thought, you were stronger than this. And just like that, Nezumi's words brought his reality crashing down. His mind cleared enough for him to realize what he was doing and just whose power he was accessing. He immediately stopped. He pulled back, fighting against the smooth voice whispering in his ear, and tore the power away from himself. Immediately he felt cold, weakened, but nonetheless he smiled. He was strong without the Kyuubi. He looked up and saw Nezumi nod once at him before vanishing off to help with the cleanup. A strange, almost familiar feeling swelled in his chest. Naruto wouldn't forget that. He hated the fact that he needed a reminder just to control that power, and he never wanted to feel that helpless again. He shook his head and removed the haze that had come over him. His arms were leaden and some of his muscles twitched without permission, but a quiet fire burned behind his eyes as he looked up at Saro. I'm ready to go again, Taicho. The man nodded, the chips in his mask revealing that the corners of his mouth turned up ever so slightly. Naruto would master this power. For some reason he felt safe, knowing that as long as he had his team to support him, he could do it. Hiruzen sighed, blowing out a long stream of smoke from his pipe as he scanned through the reports on his desk from the recent Proto-Bijou incident. He was delighted for his troops at how they handled it, even after the situation escalated, and it brought a small smile to his face. He compared it to a proud grandfather reading about his grandchildren's accomplishments. The smile turned melancholic as he read Naruto's name and just what he had done on the mission. It had been almost 5 years since his decision to place the boy in ANBU and, so far, he had seen nothing but good reports from his captain. As he swiveled on his chair and began rifling through a cabinet his worries began to increase. It had been a while since he flicked through Naruto's file, mostly due to other matters occupying his attention and the fact the boy mostly flew under the radar in ANBU, or at least as much as he could in that squad. However, his eyes widened slightly as he began reading through the number of missions the blonde had performed in, not to mention the number of S and A-ranked missions alone. Slowly the old Sandame's already wrinkled brow began to furrow as he worried for the boy's continued mental stability if he continued to stay in the corp. Chapter 7, Seventh Link. If he was being perfectly honest with himself, Naruto was rather confused as he stood before the Hokage, or rather knelt, as was correct for an ANBU. For one thing, it was strange that he was here alone without his squad, and on top of that it was rather strange for him to be here at all. The Hokage had a set of very experienced and very loyal ANBU who he dealt with directly, the ANBU commander included. Simple grunts, even with 5 years' worth of experience, answered to their captains, who in turn answered to the commander. That was currently an operative under the pseudonym Ukami, the mask supposedly every good ANBU aspired to. For Naruto to be kneeling in front of the Hokage himself was unorthodox. Missions handed directly from the village's leader tended to be of the upper S-ranked kind. That, or it was for bad news, which the aged Sandame was known to give out directly. As Naruto tried to avoid looking up at those kindly, but age was in eyes, he had an unsettling feeling that he was not here due to the former. Finally, after a long few moments of the Hokage looking at him and gently puffing on his pipe, which quickly became awkward, the man gave him a subtle motion to rise. "It's good to see you, Naruto-kun." Behind his mask Naruto's eyes widened considerably, he hadn't heard his own name spoken in 5 years. In fact, he was so used to going by Karasu it was almost unsettling to hear his birth name. There was also the fact that while under service in the corp, an ANBU's name was tantamount to their greatest secret, even if their identity became compromised. "Hokage-sama?" He managed in as neutral a tone as possible, if nothing else to hide the confusion that would be evident on his features were it not for his mask. While the blonde may have had a few issues with authority, and Saru was occasionally willing to let slide the occasional lack of proper suffix, he knew no such courtesies would be extended when it came to the Hokage. To his furthered confusion, the Hokage seemed mildly bothered by his proper and formal greeting. "Ah yes, Karasu-kun, I apologize for the slip." Naruto had a feeling that it was nothing of the sort. It hadn't taken long into his first year for Naruto to realize he had been placed in ANBU to curtail the more abrasive side of his newfound personality. He had thought the Hokage would be pleased, or at least satisfied with the changes that had been made to the blonde. Even he had to admit that he was thinking clearer and acting with far greater efficiency than a few years ago. He couldn't say the changes were completely welcome, but there were certainly benefits to not being a murderous psychopath with no regard for human life. Now at least, he was only a sociopath with very little regard for it, a marked improvement in his squad's eyes. "How are you doing in ANBU, Karasu-kun?" 5 years is a rather long time for any operative to stay in the service, especially for one as young as you. Naruto blinked, his confusion was subsiding as it became clear just what this meeting would be about, but it didn't make his answer any more certain. "I am fine, Hokage-sama, my mission record is well above corp standards, my training is progressing at a rate my captain finds suitable and I have a tolerable relationship with most members." It was a clinical answer that left out the fact there were also many members within ANBU that did not tolerate Naruto's presence in the slightest. It was hardly a secret who he was to anybody that had even been on a single mission with him. He wasn't in the habit of hiding his chains after all. Despite the answer that would be met with a cheerful and satisfied nod with most members of the organization, the Hokage once again looked displeased. "Is there anything else, Karasu-kun? How about the relationship with your squad mates?" Naruto couldn't help as his head tilted to the side ever so slightly. He wasn't sure how to answer that. It wasn't as though he could simply tell the Hokage that he had never felt more like he belonged to a family than when he was with his squad mates. It would be highly inappropriate. It was enough to say the realization had shocked Naruto when it had come to him one day when training with Nezumi. Instead, he simply opted for a safe answer that wouldn't reflect badly on him or the squad. "We have an amicable working relationship." When he saw the Hokage's brow furrow ever so slightly, he worried he had said something incorrect. While positive relations were highly recommended within ANBU due to the stressful line of work, close attachments and relationships were discouraged for the same reason. There was also the high mortality rate when working within ANBU that acted as deterrent enough for close bonds to form, when they could be so easily shredded on a mission. "I see." The Hokage was quiet for a while, his hands held in front of him as he appeared to mull things over in his mind. Finally, he looked up, an unusually serious expression on his worn features. And how would you feel, Karasu, if you were to leave the ANBU? Almost immediately Naruto opened his mouth to protest, however, nothing but a rather strangled gasp escaped his throat. Even the Hokage didn't seem to hear it. He just stood there a few minutes, thankful the mask was emotionless, because beneath it he was cycling through them faster than he would have thought possible. He obviously did not want to leave the ANBU. For the first time he felt accepted. While the emotions were new and confusing to him, it didn't mean he just wanted to discard them and move forward. On the contrary, he had finally started to feel like he could really open up to his squad, and for that to just end was an unpleasant thought. Unfortunately, these passionate words were stifled by the mantra that had been pounded and drilled into his head repeatedly over the years. ANBU were tools for the village's use, and when the time came, were to be discarded as such. He was a tool of the Hokage as long as he wore the mask. It was a mantra that was so deeply ingrained he found he actually couldn't find it in him to speak. If that is what you think best, Hokage-sama. It came out through slightly gritted teeth and with a brief catch, but it came out all the same. He loathed every word. Hiruzen regarded him for a long few moments, from his stiff and proper posture to the way his hands were just beginning to clench into fists. His eyes briefly flickered to the window taking up most of the space at the back of the office. The Hokage monument loomed above the village, judging the meeting with stony silence. Very well, Operative Karasu, from this moment you are released from service in the ANBU, to return to the normal Shinobi Corp. He stared at the blonde-haired former ANBU for a long few moments before Naruto hesitantly took off his mask and placed it on the desk. Beneath was a face that Hiruzen hadn't seen in 5 years, and in that time, Naruto had certainly grown up. Where before there was a pudgy-faced boy with wide, innocent blue eyes, now Naruto had more angular features. His eyes had grown into a colder shade, like 2 chips of ice, while the whisker marks that were such a prominent feature on his cheeks seemed to have deepened and become more feral. It's good to see you again, Naruto, Hiruzen greeted as if the blonde had just stepped into the room and Karasu had walked out. In a twisted sort of way, he had. His smile grew a little, stretching the wrinkles around his eyes as his entire expression seemed to soften. Despite the hardness that seemed to have entered the young Jinchuriki's own features, he could still see the little boy that had been so eager to play about in his office, occasionally donning the wide-brimmed hat of his position that was so comically oversized on the toddler's head. Hokage-sama, Naruto replied with a slight nod, his tone uncertain but at the same time clipped and brusque. Again, it only seemed to increase Hiruzen's worry over the effect ANBU had had on the boy, perhaps permanently. Naruto had no idea his irritation was only reaffirming the Hokage's decision that taking him out of the corp was the correct thing to do. Now Naruto, you coming out of the ANBU puts me into a bit of a situation as, by your skills alone in your mission record and your captain's reports, you easily qualify for the Jounin rank. At that, Naruto felt a bit of the tension in his body switch out with surprise. It felt like only yesterday Saru had made him eligible to move squads by ascertaining he was around Chunin level. He had always felt like that position would be beyond him until he was able to fight one of his squad mates and feel like an equal. What he didn't know was, while influenced by Naruto's impressive skill on paper, Hiruzen's decision heavily weighed on the fact that Naruto might slaughter any genin team he was on due to sheer boredom. Despite reports to the contrary exonerating Naruto's mental stability, without witnessing it firsthand he was heavily biased to those first days when it looked like the Jinchuriki might kill someone for simply looking at him funny. Likewise, any Chunin team he would be placed on would be heavily unbalanced by the blonde's superior skill. None of Saru's reports had ever particularly highlighted Naruto's abilities as a leader, in part because he had never been forced to assume the role. However, Naruto-kun. Naruto's hands clenched into fists for a moment at the rather patronizing suffix. Even Teiko had stopped calling him that a few years ago. Becoming a Jounin is a somewhat complicated process, usually involving myself and the council of clan heads looking over your mission records and deciding whether or not you are ready to accept the position. He sighed, releasing a stream of smoke from his mouth. Unfortunately, as an ANBU, any relevant mission records are heavily classified and for mine or the ANBU commander's eyes only. There is also the unfortunate fact that you do not have any official shinobi license, which makes granting you the position difficult. Naruto's fingernails were beginning to dig into his palm as he forced himself not to interject and refute taking him out of the ANBU so pointlessly. Luckily though, the independent Jounin exams are in the next few weeks. Any shinobi of Chunin rank or higher is eligible to participate under my recommendation, and the rank of Chunin is one I can give you immediately once you obtain a license. The aged man stopped for a moment with a pleasant smile, as if expecting some form of thanks. When Naruto remained stonily silent though, still in a rather stiff posture, he frowned and continued. In any case, you will not be the only one from Konoha participating this year, so you will have the support of the village behind you. He smiled warmly, hoping to see a similar expression from the blonde. He got nothing. Is that all, Hokage-sama? Naruto finally said, once again in a curt and professional tone that carried little of the broiling emotion he felt. Hiruzen just sighed, releasing another billowing cloud of smoke as he leaned back in his comfortable chair. I suppose not, Naruto-kun, but remember, my door is always open if you need anything. Naruto just nodded once before turning around and quickly marching out of the office, rather unused to not simply slipping into the shadows of the ceiling or flickering out of the window in a trademark shunshin. No, now he was expected to leave like a regular shinobi, just another face among the herd. Naruto felt cold inside at the thought. Deep inside the training ground area, close to training ground 44, which most jounin avoided anyway, people skirted around a particular clearing. It was mostly because the sounds emerging through the tree line weren't all that inviting. The crash of toppled trees, the ground being rent open, and thunderous explosions echoed into the surroundings. It didn't help that an aura of anger, rage and fury weighed down on anybody that even tried to approach, like a physical force. Many wouldn't admit it, but it brought up old memories of the Kyuubi attack. That was reason enough for most not to bother. In the center of it all, surrounded by the pointless destruction he had wrought, Naruto snarled as his chains ripped another tree right out of the ground. He threw it in a random direction, like a petulant child might a plate. It crashed through several trees before falling over with a pained creak, expanding the already tortured clearing. Naruto panted, fatigue beginning to set into his muscles and the first signs of chakra exhaustion setting in. He wasn't satisfied. A growl rose up from deep in his throat, the orange aura shimmering around his body condensing around his fists, and he launched himself across the open grass at a boulder. His fists smashed right through it, his momentum carrying him a few more feet before his feet brought him to a halt. Not before digging two ragged trenches through the earth. Around him, little pieces of rocks fell to the ground with a satisfying clatter as the cloud of dust slowly dissipated. With a scream of frustration, he looked up to the sky and released a soul-piercing roar from deep within himself that likely would have had Anbu sprinting to his location if training with the Kyuubi's chakra hadn't recently become a common event with his team. Randomly, his thickened, spiked and generally more vicious-looking chains lashed out at everything around them. They sliced through the ground and the trees, grasped at rocks that they quickly flung haphazardly in any direction, and generally just allowed Naruto to vent his frustrations. Finally, though, when it all caught up with him, the orange aura slowly dissipated, his chains reluctantly retracted, and he fell onto his back, breathing heavily through eyes blurred with stinging tears. I think you were right, Sarataishu, only Karasu could mess up a training ground as badly as Kuma. Teiko's familiar voice floated across the now still air of the wrecked clearing, causing Naruto to blink and crane his neck from his position on the ground. Sure enough, when he looked over, he spotted his entire team standing across from him at the tree line. Although thanks to his little tantrum the boundary between forest and clearing was somewhat blurred. He clambered to his feet and rubbed his eyes as subtly as he could, realizing he must look every bit the petulant child throwing a fit. Sarutai. Naruto trailed off as he realized something very important: none of his teammates were wearing their masks. They still donned their customary uniforms, only without the pale gray body armor that went with it. It was a startling revelation, having worked, eaten and lived with these people for so long and never having actually known what they looked like. Karasu, or should I call you Naruto now? The blonde nearly flinched, hearing his own captain say his name was like the final nail in the coffin. He was really out. You don't need to call me Taicho anymore, I had thought you'd be happy about that. Although for security reasons, I'd ask you still call me Saru. He was a surprisingly kindly-looking man with a thin, scraggly mustache and narrow, pale eyes. Ah, Kuma doesn't want to see Karasu go. Naruto was suddenly assaulted as the massive man that had previously been standing behind his companion shot forward, his small, innocent eyes tearing up as the bulky Anbu wailed loudly, arms open to crush Naruto into a hug. He was stopped in his tracks though as Teiko grabbed the man by the back of the collar and, in an improbable display of strength given the much smaller man's size, held him back. Now Kuma-kun, Naruto had to go his own way eventually, Teiko explained, like a parent might to their sobbing child before offering a rather saddened smile to the blonde. It was just sooner than we were exacting. Teiko wasn't what Naruto had been expecting. For one, the man was bald, which he had previously kept hidden with his Anbu cloak's hood. He also had an oddly styled bushy mustache that arced out on either side of his face. Teiko is right. Finally, Naruto let his eyes drift over to Nezumi, taking in her half-lidded, bored-looking violet eyes and the way her eyebrows had almost a zigzag to them. Without her ANBU chest armor, her large bust pressed against the simple black vest they all wore. When she looked over at him, her gaze softened considerably and a small smile pulled at the edges of her lips. But that doesn't mean he is not part of the squad, she intoned quietly. You aren't here to say goodbye? Naruto asked cautiously, almost afraid of the answer. Sara cocked an eyebrow at the young Jinchuriki, a bemused expression crossing over his features. Of course not, Sara offered, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world, leaving Naruto overwhelmed. Even if Hokage-sama decided to remove you from the ANBU, you will always be a part of this squad. What gave you that idea? He cast a sly look around the wrecked clearing. Besides, if we didn't, I would fear for the safety of training grounds everywhere. Naruto was forced to look down at the ground and grumble unintelligibly. When he looked up, he suddenly found Teiko next to him, arms slung around the slightly shorter blonde's shoulders. Personally, I say this calls for a celebration. It's not every day our Kurosakuen grows up and becomes a Jounin now, is it? If Naruto wasn't already exhausted from venting his anger on the surrounding plant life, he might have tried to spear the man for the comment. I'm not a Jounin, I have to take an exam first. It sounded rather odd, having to take an exam to become the vaunted rank, although he supposed it wouldn't be a pen and paper test like one might think. At the grumbled comment, his teammates turned to look at one another with amused expressions before Saru and Teiko began laughing. Even the corners of Nezumi's impassive lips turned up slightly as Kuma laughed along purely because everybody else was. I don't think you have anything to fear on that end, as long as you remember everything we've taught you, Saru informed him in his usual sagely manner, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. He appeared to think better of it after a moment, and added in as an afterthought, just don't accidentally kill one of your comrades, it may not reflect too well on you. He was only half joking. But I think I agree with Teiko for once, as you are no longer our kohai, perhaps a drink is in order. That was how Naruto found himself surrounded by his former teammates in a small bar near the seedier area of Konoha that the older ANBU often frequented. Having seen the results of alcohol intoxication before, Naruto had steered clear of the drink out of confusion for why they would want to act in such a way. However, with Kuma and Saru sandwiching him in the spongy booth, the clear and rather innocent-looking liquid placed in front of him didn't look to be a request. After a moment of hesitation, where the blonde simply swillied the sake around the little saucer, he finally just shrugged, tipping it all down his throat in one. If his teammates were expecting much of a reaction to the blonde's first drink, they were rather disappointed. The burn as the drink passed down his throat wasn't much of an issue, as Naruto had recently faced worse when training in the Kyuubi's chakra, and as an ANBU he wasn't exactly the type to show discomfort or pain. Instead, he focused on the flavor of the rice wine, the faint hints of fruit in the surprisingly dry liquid. For a moment he felt warmer, like his blood had been raised a few degrees, but it passed and soon he felt no different. He looked up to notice the squad staring at him expectantly. What? It's good? His teammates all looked at their own drinks with a frown before necking it themselves, the sight looking rather comical as Kuma struggled with his tiny saucer. So slowly, the evening progressed into night, with Naruto sitting amongst his former squad, occasionally drinking and watching them do the same. They would talk too, mostly about missions they had been on, or amusing anecdotes from their time out of missions. One common vein was that all their stories revolved around Naruto in some compromising or embarrassing moment, or at least his squad trying to get him into one. And by squad, they meant Teiko. As the night progressed, Naruto caught himself wearing an uncharacteristic and vaguely melancholic smile, only to quickly correct himself. During one telling of Teiko trying to convince Naruto to peek on the women's hot springs with him, only to be caught by Nezumi and proverbially left to the dogs. The dogs in this case being the furious Kunoichi on the other side of the fence, Naruto actually laughed. It was something the blonde had rarely done when not soaked in blood. He remembered the moment well, especially Teiko's screams as the man was trodden into the dirt by a crowd of towel-clad women as Naruto watched on from a nearby tree. To his teammates' consternation, the night progressed without Naruto showing any sign of becoming drunk. He had almost the same amount of sake as Kuma, having come to appreciate the sweet taste over the evening, and even the muscle-bound ANBU was beginning to look tipsy. By now, Teiko was sprawled out on the table, drool slowly leaking from the corner of his mouth. Kuma was giggling to himself for no discernible reason, and Saru, while outwardly appearing fine, was slurring his words slightly. Nezumi was the most amusing. The woman was simply staring ahead, her body swaying slightly before she would correct it with the smallest squeak of a hiccup. It was Saru who finally called it a night, still apparently disgruntled at being drunk under the table. He bid farewell to the others, promising to do it again as he slung Takeo over his shoulders and walked out, visibly trying not to sway. The man certainly had good self-control, which Naruto could attest to as he continued to slowly sip at his saucer. Kuma, apparently taking his Taishu's leave as some kind of sign, stumbled out of the booth. Lacking his usual modicum of self-control, the enormous man managed to break the bar's doorframe slightly as he tried to walk right through it. Naruto, to his own surprise, found himself grinning at the sight. As he looked around again, he noticed Nezumi still staring ahead, her eyes narrowing and widening intermittently. She made no sign of moving and Naruto could only sigh to himself, wondering if all of this would have been better if he could in fact become drunk. Still, in a rare moment of genuine human compassion that most believe the oft-bloodstained Jinchuriki lacked, he manages to guide Nezumi out of the bar. The woman seemed in a complete daze and didn't seem to really understand her surroundings. Thankfully, hauling her back to her apartment was rather simple, even if it involved a lot of handholding that Naruto could have done without. He was tempted to carry the woman by his chains, but 1, he didn't know what she might do, and 2, he wasn't sure how the villagers might react to him making off with a rather buxom woman this late at night when she was so obviously dazed and confused. Instead, using a rare bit of foresight and common sense, Naruto took Nezumi through the back alleys and quieter streets he knew like the back of his hand, until he was back at their apartment complex. With a tinge of irritation, Naruto realized that as a now former ANBU, he might be forced to leave this place, despite it being his home for the past 5 years. Still, pushing his thoughts to one side for the moment so that he didn't accidentally shred a building in his frustration, Naruto quickly half-guided, half-pushed Nezumi up the stairs and through her door. It had become second nature now for him to avoid the various traps she kept around her apartment. In fact, the woman had seemed rather eager to show them to him, as she was when teaching anything to her self-proclaimed student. Thankfully the older ANBU operative seemed gain some semblance of coherence as she spotted her bed, a grateful murmur escaping her lips. In an obviously practiced motion that no amount of alcohol could steal from her muscles' memory, Nezumi slipped her sword from her back, span it once and planted it straight into the wooden floor. A few similarly shaped indents in the floor showed that it wasn't the first time she had done this. Embarrassingly, Naruto also bore witness to the woman suddenly shrugging off all her clothes, in what seemed like one unbroken motion. It became very apparent Nezumi wasn't one for underwear as Naruto quickly turned away, a strange, unwelcome feeling tugging at his stomach. As he made to leave though, a slender, deceptively delicate hand snaked around his wrist and pulled him back. Instantly a threatening amount of chains burst from his back, all angled towards the perpetrator a mere hair's breadth from her skin. Naruto breathed heavily for a moment, his eyes wide as far too much of his body was touched for him to feel comfortable. His face was in the awkward position of being pressed directly into the soft flesh of Nezumi's right breast and all he could feel was her odd warmth and the sound of her steady heartbeat. Slightly above him, the woman muttered unintelligibly in her sleep as her body continued to curl around Naruto's to the point where his chains vibrated at the conflicting instincts to go full hedgehog. After a few moments he calmed, the warmth from the older woman's body and the soft comfort of her chest lulling him into a drowsy state. Slowly, the chains pulled back, returning to his body where their soft glow could no longer light up the room. Now in the darkened apartment, with Nezumi hugging him to her naked body like some kind of stuffed animal, Naruto had to admit that maybe this wasn't so bad. He would vehemently deny it and would be gone long before Nezumi woke up, but it definitely wasn't not good. Naruto stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, for the time being at least, clad in nothing more than his ANBU leggings. Today he would have to leave for the Jounin exams, but he ran into the small problem of realizing he had nothing to wear. It had never been a particular problem before, as he always just wore the ANBU uniform. He couldn't wear that anymore, so he was put in a dilemma. It had been an awkward affair at the clothes and supply shop as he, having no prior experience shopping, never mind for clothes, had no idea what to do. In the end, he ended up buying a load of random bits of clothing around his size that were now strewn about on the floor around him. He felt fairly safe just wearing his ANBU pants tied around his ankles with his normal shin-height sandals. That was innocuous enough. The rest of it he could only snarl at, wishing that he didn't have to worry about such stupid things. He eventually shrugged on a chain net shirt, like the ones Nezumi wore under her uniform, only to realize he now looked like a male stripper from the underground slave ring they once busted. To fix it, he quickly pulled on a pale green shirt with a black stripe running down the center only to get frustrated by the sleeves. He messed about with it for a few moments before growling. He ended up ripping off the left sleeve entirely, leaving the mesh shirt to poke out halfway down his bicep. The right sleeve was far too long and dangled halfway down his fingers, but looking in the mirror, Naruto just decided to leave it. He tied his new headband, that he previously had little use for, around his neck. He looked down at the Chunin jacket lying limply on the floor to his right only to sneer and ignore it entirely. He didn't want to wear something so bulky and movement restricting anyway. Instead, he grabbed his ANBU arm guards and strapped them on, in the case of his right one, under the sleeve. He remembered how often they had come in handy deflecting swords in kunai when they got too close and didn't want to part with them. Finally, he looked back in the mirror, deciding that this was good enough. As he stared, he noticed his face, the face he hadn't really paid much attention to for the past few years. A thought occurred to him about how he was supposed to look. It had never mattered all that much when hiding behind his mask. Right now, it was set into an irritated scowl, which he quickly straightened out until it was neutral and impassive. This was how people expected an ANBU's features to appear. After a moment he tried a smile, only to get a rather awkward-looking affair with what had to be entirely too many teeth to be friendly. He quickly discarded it and ran a hand through his hair with a disgruntled sigh. That was a different problem. In his time in ANBU his hair had grown quite long, inching down past his neck at the back and beginning to shadow his face at the front. Likewise, two bangs had begun to form on either side of his face that rather irritated him when he turned his head without the protection of his mask. He tried sweeping his hair back with his hand and for a moment it was successful, at least until a single lock fell back down, falling almost to the bridge of his nose across his face. He growled deep in his throat before deciding to just tie up the bangs with a bit of bandage he had lying around. Looking at his face now, beside the deep and angry-looking whisker marks on either cheek, he could almost compare his hair to that of the old clan styles before the village system. Saro had shown him a lot of pictures from back then. He had been rather insistent Naruto learn at least a bit about history. He couldn't find it in himself to care though, as he struggled to make that one stubborn lock of hair fall in line with the rest before crying out in frustration. A chain lashed out and smashed straight through his mirror as he scrabbled ineffectually with his blonde hair for another few seconds. Ah, Kami, damn it. He finally gave up and simply left it how it was. Before moving to the window and jumping out, he would sort out his appearance later. Not that it would matter much, his hair had a tendency to fall flat when he was soaked in blood anyway. Chapter 8, 8th Link. It was a set of rather confusing and fast-paced events that saw Uzumaki Naruto standing on a barren dirt track in the middle of Kusa no Kuni, holding a fluffy and rather nervous-looking white rabbit. The petite, effeminate creature was staring up at him with innocent black eyes, occasionally shivering as it caught the painfully neutral gaze of the teen holding it. He was sure that if his former squad mates could have seen him then, holding what by all rights should have been some young girl's pet, he would be the butt of the team's jokes weeks. As it was, he was currently charged with protecting the rather pathetic creature, naturally in an effort to make the first test of the Jounin exams more difficult. Because for what other reason would Naruto have accepted taking responsibility for the all-too-fluffy animal than lack of choice? Yes, Naruto was currently staring down an overgrown path in a darkened corner of one of the famously oversized forests. He was here because this was where the biannual, independent Jounin exams took place, so again, lack of choice. The heat within the jungle environment was stifling, and he had seen a few prospective Jounin from Kumo forced to remove their bulkier clothing. They were used to the frigid temperatures of mountainous regions, not the sticky, humid heat of such thick and overbearing jungles. Even in his admittedly light clothing, Naruto found himself with a noticeable sheen of sweat without needing to exert himself at all. It was unpleasant, and as far as Naruto was concerned, the sooner he could get back to the familiar, less humid heat of High no Kuni the better. His reception in the exams was mixed. Nobody seemed to recognize him at first and a few even ridiculed his presence, citing the fact that a pipsqueak like him had no right to be at the big boy exams. He had quickly altered their perceptions on that matter, nearly getting himself thrown out of the exam in the process. Afterwards though, when rumors began to spread that Kusari no Naruto was present at the exams, he received a much wider berth. On the flip side, many of the prospective Jounin now stared at him with more calculative, or even hungrier looks, no doubt looking to prove themselves. The reactions from his own village's shinobi were less mixed. They simply chose to ignore his presence completely, as though he would vanish if left unacknowledged. Luckily, there were few specimens from any of the villages present, as the Jounin exams were a much more selective affair than the, in comparison friendlier, Chunin exams. Of course, irritatingly, there seemed to be one glaring exception to the rule. So what do you think this'll be, Gaki? Naruto's eye twitched as the voice that had been pestering him for the past 2 days decided to speak up. The purple-haired woman, whose smirk he could practically feel on the back of his head, also took the opportunity to lean into him, as she was wont to do, pressing her sizable assets up against his back. Years of desensitization from such things, due to Nozumi's lack of respect for his personal space, quelled any less than professional reaction he may have had. It was still annoying. I don't know, he ground out, hoping the woman would get the message and leave. The animals suggest some aspect of protection, so we will likely either be pitted against one another or against some form of proctor. The former seemed the more likely in his mind. Kusa had already shown themselves to be rather hands-off in their approach to the exams. The first real test they had issued was simply finding the start line to the first official portion of the exam. Presumably, they were supposed to use information-gathering skills to glean the information. Naturally, Naruto had threatened the nearest proctor he could find until the man told him. People tended to speak when suspended over ravines by their feet. Ah, you really need to learn to lighten up, Gaki. This stern and proper attitude's gonna add years onto you. There was a pause as the woman seemed to look up in thought, a barely restrained grin on her impish features. Although, I suppose you could use shrimp? Again, Naruto's eye twitched rather violently as he methodically counted backwards from 10, an effective technique he had used to quell his anger in the past. Mitarashi-san, the stern and proper attitude you referred to was the only thing stopping me spearing you into a tree by your throat. Anko only looked amused as she whirled around on one foot, so she was in front of the teen, crouching slightly so that they were around eye level. She too had a small animal tucked under her arm, a terrified little cat that was shivering like it had been rolling around in a snowbank. See? That's more like it. You don't need to hold back around me, kid. She seemed rather proud of herself as she looked off into the foreground, putting on the air of somebody accomplished and wise. If I could snap Nai-chan out of her funk, I can do the same for you. Count on it. She grinned broadly, the same smile that would set anybody who knew her cowering in fear of whatever dastardly plans she brewed behind that innocent facade. Wonderful, I look forward to it, Naruto managed in a perfect monotone, his eyes lidded and disinterested in an attempt to make the woman lose interest in him. Sarah's parting's words about not killing his comrades from the village played in his head over and over. It seemed not to be though, as Anko smiled like she hadn't heard the complete lack of anything resembling enthusiasm. You'll see, Gaki, stick with me and I'll make an upstanding man out of you yet. She stuck her thumbs in the lapels of the oversized trench coat she wore, pushing them out like Naruto had seen some merchants do to their jackets. I'm sure. Luckily, he was saved from further interaction as Akusa Jounin finally turned up, apparently having decided that all of the Jounin prospects that would arrive had. Anko skulked off, mingling with the crowd of chunin that were milling about on the wide dirt path and leaving Naruto alone amidst a crowd of unfamiliar faces. Ahem, the old, gray-haired Jounin that had walked out in front of him caught everyone's attention, his voice sounding rough and hoarse. I figure everybody's pretty much here, so we'll get started. He looked lazily about at the assembled group, absently adjusting the loose headband around his arm. As you may have noticed, you were assigned a small creature to protect. He loosely motioned to the harmless little creatures they all held. If that animal dies, you are disqualified from the exams immediately. A few of the more bloodthirsty in the crowd looked down at their quivering animals in disappointment. You managed to find this place one way or another, so you are ready to proceed with the exams. He motioned to the darkened path in front of them absently. Down there is an obstacle course of a sort. Completion of the first exam is contingent upon making it through both alive and with your passenger unharmed. However, only the first 32 participants to finish will be allowed to advance, if that many actually make it that far at least. There is no killing in this portion of the exam, however that courtesy does not extend to your fellow participants' passengers. Other than that, do not leave the marked path. This will also result in immediate disqualification. Proctors will be constantly monitoring you for breaches in these rules. Hearing all this, Naruto subtly slipped backwards, slightly behind the line of eager chunin, his chains quietly extending from his body. Alright, you will go on my signal. The man brought his fingers to his lips at the same time Naruto began maneuvering his chains into position, a devious grin on his features that would have made Teiko proud. The proctor looked at them all one last time, eyes lingering on the slightly concealed Naruto for a moment, before letting out a piercing whistle. A few things happened at once in that split moment. The faster of the chunin immediately took off, using their build and inherent speed to give themselves a head start. At the same time, Naruto's chains suddenly shot down, piecing the neck of over 10 different little creatures without remorse, simultaneously knocking the same amount of people out of the running. Apparently, he wasn't the only one with this kind of preemptive idea though, as he saw a blue flash of electricity from somewhere to his left. He ignored it though, using the other chains he had implanted into the ground in a vaguely slingshot-esque manner to launch himself forward at speed. He made sure his passenger was safe by placing it in a sort of makeshift backpack made out of some of the finer chains he could create, that served to both hold and restrain the small bunny. His malicious smile only grew at the curses and shouts of outrage that slowly faded into the background as he sprinted down the overgrown road in front of him. As he turned around the first bend, his sixth sense forced him to his knees as he barely skidded beneath the humming blade of a Kumo Chunin. Making a split-second decision, Naruto used his forward momentum to spin, releasing two chains from his hips that lashed out in a circular motion with him. At the last moment he remembered to blunt the blades on the ends, already irritated by the no-killing rule. Instantly, the Chunin found themselves unexpectedly tangled up in the glowing golden restraints before being picked up and promptly thrown across the path into a sturdy-looking tree. Naruto didn't look to see if he got up and continued on his sprint, never having lost pace. It was mostly thanks to Nozumi's training. The woman was rather obsessed with never breaking the flow of motions. She believed that everything done in life should be a simple transition from one event to the next without faltering or hesitance. Or at least, that was how Naruto understood the woman. She didn't tell him in so many words, but then, she didn't say many words period. The first obstacle that Naruto came across seemed to just be a long pool of water blocking the path, rimmed on both sides by dense foliage that left no path but forward. Not trusting the assumed simplicity of the task, Naruto made sure to jump as far as he could before landing atop the water in a crouch a few meters from the end of the pool. It turned out to be the right decision, as the water was actually some kind of viscous adhesive that quickly tried to suck him under, despite his use of chakra to stay afloat. He was forced to wade through it almost painfully slowly by the end, but he did at least reach the end, pulling himself out with some difficulty. He continued on his sprint down a seemingly straight path, but after a whole minute of straight sprinting he began to grow suspicious of just how long it was taking to reach any more obstacles. He stopped for a moment to look back, but there was nothing there, not even any pursuers. That was suspicious in of itself. There were over 100 prospective jounin in these exams, he would have expected some to catch up. It was only when he looked to the side and saw a suspiciously familiar giant mushroom did he realize what had happened, quickly bringing his hands into a ram seal. Kai! The world around him shimmered for a moment as he repressed and flared his chakra in quick succession. It seemed just in time too, as he sported a pair of Iwagakure shinobi bearing down on him, having caught up after the pandemonium at the start line. He almost reacted too slowly as the larger one of the two, a burly-looking teen with a round nose, chubby cheeks and a ragged yellow scarf, ran through hand seals in a blur of motion. Doton, Dachabaku! He shouted, slamming his hand into the ground mid-run and dragging it through the earth like some kind of meaty plow. The effect was instantaneous, a ripple that thundered across the ground towards the blonde, tearing up the earth and generally carving out the ground in a bid to catch him. He reacted on his instincts and jumped up and away from the dangerous technique that would have swallowed him, only to realize that this was their goal. The smaller of the two, either a boyish-looking girl or an effeminate-looking boy, used the large one's shoulders as a stepping stone to launch his or herself into the air at the blonde, fists encased in a sturdy layer of tough stone. Naruto wanted to groan mid-air as he actually recognized who he now knew to be a girl. She was that Tsuchikige's granddaughter Kuratsuchi. All ANBU were briefed on the immediate families of the various village leaders on the continent so that they wouldn't accidentally kill them and cause an international incident. The Sandaime was very particular with that sort of thing. Still floating some ways off the ground as he reached the zenith of his leap, Naruto wondered if just roughing her up counted. His groan was because he couldn't help but think it was so much easier being an ANBU. He was just pointed in a direction and told to kill. He decided that he wasn't going to jeopardize his role in these exams, mostly because he never wanted to participate in anything like them again, just because one girl had connections. To be honest, she had a rather sound plan. Without leverage, most shinobi were useless in the air and incredibly vulnerable to attack. Even Naruto was reasonably unprotected in the air, as it was very difficult to manipulate his chains beyond stabbing and curling, which made mid-air combat awkward. Luckily, Naruto didn't have to be in the air if he didn't want to be. Seeing as the earth technique from the bulkier shinobi had passed beneath him harmlessly, Naruto shot two chains out of his feet, using them to rapidly drag his body down and out the way of Kuratsuchi's fists. The girl was obviously unprepared for the quick reaction. Saro had always told him his on-the-fly tactics were praiseworthy, even if he never actually praised him. She was doubly surprised when he grabbed her ankles on his way down, using his newfound leverage to throw her rather roughly into her accomplice. Both were bowled to the ground as Naruto landed in a tucked roll, a smirk on his features as his chains lashed out again. They wrapped around both unprepared shinobi's ankles before picking them up and promptly tossing them across the path into a copse of trees. The simple and familiar action allowed Naruto to breathe a nostalgic sigh that had been one of his favorite things to do in ANBU. He and Kuma had even made a game of it once. Let's see who can throw bandits further. Naruto was proud to say he only lost 2 out of 3 times, proud, because Kuma could throw people like they were kunai. His moment of reminiscence nearly cost him, as a blue crackling blur shot by, obviously trying to sever his chains. Luckily he retracted them into his body with a crack, nearly taking a step back from the recoil. The blue blur quickly resolved itself as it skidded to a stop, revealing itself to be a Kumo shinobi with shortcut blonde hair a few years older than Naruto. She was wearing the traditional white flak jacket more like a bustier, accentuating her growing curves, and had the most piercing set of cold blue eyes he had ever seen. She seemed to give him a once-over, obviously sizing him up, before her eyes narrowed and she took off in a sprint again, her window having closed the moment she missed Naruto's chains. Naruto wondered if she decided against fighting him because of his reputation or because she didn't think him worth it. With a small and uncharacteristically excited grin he ran after her, deciding there was only one way to find out. She had the height advantage and was a bit faster than the smaller blonde, but he used unusual tactics like using his chains to drag himself forward off trees, keeping them roughly the same distance apart. He only grew more enthralled as his attempts to ensnare her or tangle up her feet were rebuked by her buzzing sword, sheathed in Raiton chakra. He would have gone for her passenger, but that would have ended things a bit too quickly for his liking, plus he couldn't see the little animal. Correction, as she turned a bend, launching herself off a tree trunk to flip over another attempt to catch her, he spotted a small bird with its wings tied nestled safely in her cleavage. The little colorful avian didn't appear to be remiss over its lodgings and was trilling with excitement with every powerful leap or sudden blurred dash. Naruto briefly lost sight of her when they both entered a pitch-black tunnel, only the glow of his chains lighting his way. However, his attention was quickly diverted as his sensitive ears picked up the sounds of various mechanisms and catches being released. Diving to the floor in a roll proved smart as he heard the whistle of kunai slicing through the air above his head. He got to his feet, chains suddenly forming a vaguely dome-shaped perimeter around him as he ran. There were a few more instances of these traps, including a rather startling moment where the entire cave was lit up in flames, but Naruto was able to bat the worst of it off and dodge the rest. He eventually emerged from the tunnel with the blonde-haired Kumo shinobi nowhere in sight, but he would be looking out for her. Come on Gaki, no slowing down now. In his brief pause at the exit to the tunnel he felt somebody hold his shoulders before using the handhold to vault over him. He instantly recognized the annoying, playful tone and looked up only to discover the fact that many had speculated but few had ever proven. Anko Mitarashi did not wear underwear beneath that skirt. Snapping out of his daze and the unusual but not altogether unpleasant sight, Naruto shook his head before grimacing. He quickly took off after the laughing Violet, her bobbing, pineapple-shaped ponytail almost mocking him as she seemed to purposefully keep a fixed distance between them. She was obviously faster and more agile than him, yet for whatever reason didn't just race ahead, choosing instead to simply pace him, occasionally turning and running backwards for a bit with a mocking grin. She seemed to effortlessly float through the obstacles, her body twisting into elegant but unnatural shapes that seemed to defy the anatomy of regular humans. However, through it all, even when a blade skimmed so close to her flesh it was like she was being shaved, she kept a lighthearted and carefree smile on her face. That was pretty funny, what you did at the starting line. I'm glad I decided to slip into the back of the pack, she causally struck up in a conversational tone, casually leaping across another strange purple-hued plant that seemed intent on capturing anybody who came near it with sticky, adhesive vines. It was like some kind of scaled-up Venus's flytrap with tentacles, and although they were more of a nuisance than a threat, there were a lot of them. But then, you wouldn't have done something like that to little ol' me, would you? She pouted in a facsimile of innocence that would have fooled lesser men. Naruto simply maintained his scowl as he shredded another plant without remorse. Ah, now you're just being no fun, and here I thought I would give you the honor of having Anko-sama keep you company. She suddenly dropped back to keep pace with him, an infuriatingly mischievous grin alighting on her features. A lot of guys would kill for that same honor, you know? Naruto wanted to snort but didn't give her the satisfaction of rising to the baits. He hoped if he ignored her, she would get bored and leave. The opposite seemed to be true though, and soon Naruto was having to almost constantly repeat the mantra of not hurting people from his village in his head. In fact, he was tempted to try and kill her animal right now, just to get her out of his hair. Technically it wouldn't be hurting her, as long as she didn't put up too much of a fight. Giving her a subtle, critical eye, he at least gleaned her build was more for flexibility and speed than power. He wasn't sure how that would fare against his chain's almost unlimited flexibility. However, he could see in the occasional paranoid glance that she wasn't one to so easily lower her guard, even with her supposed lackadaisical attitude. The main problem was that, once again, he couldn't spot her passenger. The little quivering cat was nowhere to be seen. Thinking back to the Kumo Kunoichi from earlier, Naruto's unconsciously drifted to the woman's chest before looking away as she caught him staring. Oh, I didn't realize you were that kind of guy Gaki, more an upstairs than a downstairs type, eh? Shoulda known. Naruto groaned internally, yet unwittingly giving the boisterous Kunoichi even more ammunition to annoy him with. Thankfully, before the idea of ending his misery, mostly by ending her, became too prominent a thought in his mind, they found the finish line to the obstacle course. She and Naruto were 8th and 9th over the line respectively, behind a few Kusa Chunin, an IWA shinobi, 2 Suna Chunin and that Kumo Kunoichi from before. There wasn't much talking between the various groups, even as Anko went about making a nuisance of herself and earning her the ire of basically everybody there, so the remaining time passed in relative quiet. Naturally, once she found out that nobody else was going to talk to her, she began bugging Naruto for the rest of the wait. He wasn't sure how she came to that conclusion, as he wasn't exactly talking to her either. In fact, she seemed rather content to simply talk at him, as if she could hear some kind of telepathic side to the conversation nobody else could. As the rest of the Chunin trickled in over the finish line, looking increasingly haggard and worn, he heard her talk about numerous topics, all without him uttering a word in return. There were numerous mentions of various nicknames people that Naruto didn't know, like Naichan, Smokestack, Hypochondriac and Cyclops. The blonde might have felt sorry for them if he had that much empathy left in him. He couldn't imagine having to put up with the Dango-obsessed nut on a daily basis. Luckily, the Anko-induced torture ended as the last 2 Chunin crossed the finish line, a particularly tired-looking duo from Konoha Naruto vaguely remembered from his times passing through the gates. Did we make it? The spiky-haired one with cloth stretching over his nose asked hopefully, smiling in relief as the Kusa proctor, who had gotten here suspiciously quickly and without a mark on him, nodded. He high-fived his friend, and despite their worn and exhausted appearance, they looked genuinely happy. Well, Izumo and Kotetsu actually made it somewhere in the exams this time around. Both men paled at the sickly sweet voice that wafted over to them from the crowd of jounin prospects. Hey Anko-san, you made it through too? The woman seemingly materialized behind the two, a bright gleam in her eye as she wrapped an arm around their shoulders. Of course, you doubted me? Both paled even further if that was possible, and Naruto had to suppress his amusement from showing. At least it wasn't him. Any further spectacle was curtailed as the proctor cleared his throat loudly. Right then, now that you have completed the first aspect of the exams, don't get too comfy yet, candidates. The proctor was cut off by a colder and decidedly more feminine voice, quickly revealed to have come from a stony-faced woman that had sunk out of the ground like it was water. The first proctor gained a tick mark over his eye as he glared at the woman. Obviously this was a common occurrence. The newcomer ignored him, turning to address the gathered Chunin and brushing back her long black hair. You may have completed the first task, but the second task will begin immediately. Both Kotetsu and Izumo groaned, while a few of the other later arrivals voiced their disapproval. They were immediately silenced by a frosty gaze. As a jounin, you cannot expect that just because you have already completed one mission, you will not be required to immediately participate in another. You are the weapon of your village, and as a jounin, that weapon is among the best your village has at its disposal. You will be used until you are blunt and cannot be of any further user. To complain about this is to be unworthy of that fine edge. From within the crowd Naruto nearly snorted. It was like listening to his ANBU conditioning all over again. He didn't particularly care about all that. If being used meant he received his validation and recognition, then all the better. Now, I will explain the rules of the second test. She motioned to the large expanse of forestry behind her that the dirt path they had all been forced to trek led to. It was fenced off by a rather flimsy gate that didn't look like it could hold back a cat, let alone some of the things that likely lurked in those darkened trees. All candidates will enter that forest. They will stay there until 16 remain either alive or not incapacitated. She gave them all a stern look, her gaze briefly lingering on the small crowd of Kusa shinobi. From this point on, killing is not prohibited. However, the animals you have been assigned will remain with you. Death of your animal means instant disqualification. Attempting to replace your animal with another's means instant disqualification. Attempting to leave the perimeter of the forest means instant disqualification. Do I make myself clear? She received at least a head nod from everybody assembled. Nobody wanted to drop out now after getting this far. Good, then you will need to assemble into teams of 2. Instantly more than a few eyebrows rose and Naruto even growled, a guttural sound from the back of his throat. Why? I thought jounin mostly work alone. The woman quickly picked him out of the crowd, leveling her neutral gaze on his dark blue eyes. Jounin are expected to work alongside whoever they are assigned to, not only that, but they are supposed to be the example to others on the team. A lack of cooperation can be fatal, no matter the rank. Naruto snorted but sat back down on the tree stump he had been lounging on. In any case, this will show how good of a character you are in choosing your allies. Naruto was about to rebut again but she turned away, ignoring him and moving on dismissively. The next exam will begin once you have chosen your partner, you have 2 minutes. Naruto lazily glanced about, noticing that the 2 Konoha shinobi that had arrived last immediately latched onto one another like they were each other's respective lifeline. He noticed the same all about the clearing, shinobi from their own villages quickly teaming up. Naruto didn't personally care, he would take whoever was left and drag them through the second exam if he had to, just as long as he didn't have to. Well, how about it, partners? It was as though Think and She Shall Appear was branded somewhere on Anko's body. The woman suddenly appeared behind him, resting her assets atop Naruto's mop of hair teasingly. The boy immediately grunted, shrugging her off and hopping off the trunk. However, a quick glance around showed that everybody else was already paired up. Anko immediately picked up on his observation and grinned impishly. Yup, seems we're stuck together, Gaki? She suddenly picked him up under one arm and gave him a rather awkward hug where it took every last drop of Naruto's willpower not to go full hedgehog. Lucky me. If Anko noticed the heavy sarcasm, she didn't say anything, instead half-guiding, half-dragging her new partner over to one of the unoccupied gates around the perimeter of the forest. Apparently, they were given a brief respite before the actual exam began as the new proctor chatted to the old one, apparently not to the man's pleasure. Anko immediately capitalized, grinning down at her diminutive teammate. So, what's the plan, boss? Naruto blinked once, doing his best not to show any other emotion but disdain as he looked up at the woman. Boss? Anko's grin never wavered as she casually leant up against the chain-link fence. Naruto swore it nearly collapsed from her weight alone. Sure, why not? I figured I'd take a back seat and just let you do you. Naruto blinked again before grunting and turning back to the forest, wondering what exactly him doing him meant. Are you a censor? He asked, mind going through the steps Saru had drilled into him. Anko shook her head, briefly gaining a more serious expression at his tone before slipping back into her usual grin. Neither am I, in which case we will either need to find a place to bunker down, set up defenses and wait for the other teams to come to us or kill each other off. From Anko's expression it was clear she was not happy about that plan. Naruto was finally able to agree with her over something, far too boring, or we keep moving and eliminate any team that comes near us. Anko's grin grew back to its usual proportions at that. Well, what do you know? Gaki knows his stuff. Naruto's only answer was another grunt. He had done enough talking for now. As if mirroring his thoughts, the buzzer attached to the top of the fence informed them that the second exam had started with an obnoxious drone. When the gate opened, Anko and Naruto casually strolled in. This was an elimination game, there was no rush. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.